you all have the benefit of having attended that first meeting. I was not at that meeting, so anytime I sort of stray from what your understanding is of where you landed, please just correct me and interrupt. But our goal here, just as a reminder, is that by the 19th of this month, all three subgroups will have done their best to generate 1 to 3 recommendations that I will compile and send back out to the full task force for its consideration at its next full meeting in October. And of course, I didn't bring my calendar into this room, and so but you all have that October date on your calendar. I don't remember what it is. As I understand it, particularly from reading the good notes that Craig prepared as to where you left off last time, was really a very, very strong endorsement of support for funding the tier program in full. And that if there's only one recommendation that would come out of this subgroup, it would be first and foremost that. But that there is education that's needed, both with the legislature and with the general public, to improve an understanding of the value of that investment in Maine dairy farms. And so there were ideas generated about how support could be increased for that program and better understanding of it. Some of the other topic areas where you didn't really land on a specific recommendation, but you discussed it, hi, Commissioner, was that if one of the main challenges is finding the funding to fully fund the tier program, then are there other ideas for additional funding sources? There was some, as I understand it, some discussion about that, but no particular conclusion around that. There was also a very strong endorsement of both the dependence of the tier program and the pricing of that on the cost of production study, and that there's only value in that study if the data is robust. And are there ways that you can either incentivize or require that farmers participate in that data accumulation and providing that information to make that a more robust data set. And then finally, a very strong endorsement of an economic impact study, again, to generate support for the value of the dairy industry as a whole, and indirectly of the tier program to support it. That's what I gleaned from that. I want to just open it up to see whether there are areas where you all feel would be of greatest benefit to focus on for this second and final meeting of your subgroup, and start there. And maybe you could just raise hands since you're all on screens.
Anyway, I unfortunately wasn't able to make the last meeting. And I had done some analysis on various syntaxes that are available. And the two in my mind that might be applicable to our desire are tobacco and adult use cannabis. And tobacco is done by the pack, and it currently is charged $2 for each pack of cigarettes. And in 2023, that $2 was collected and was $149 million. And it has been climbing slowly for the last 3 years. It's basically at a plateau level. So it was 147 in 2021, 146 in 2022, and 149 in 2023. So essentially it's flat. If you looked at $2 as being that requirement, then if something like 25 cents were added to that, which might make a few more people not smoke, which might reduce the overall total, you would still end up collecting way too much money. But anyway, it would be a large number. That would be 1/8 of that. So that would be just under $20 million a year. So it might have to be something closer to 10 cents or 15 cents if it was tacked onto the tax for tobacco. Similarly, on the adult use cannabis, last year they collected $20.9 million, and the tax is 10% on the retail value of cannabis, adult cannabis products sold. So if it was 2% added to the 10%, so the total was 12%, then that would be $4 million on last year's number. But the cannabis adult use is continuing to grow. It's a fairly strong growth curve. So in the future, that number would be more than $4 million. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Julie as to what she thinks the actual number is required, even to have funded this year's total tier program, which was cut back by 25%.
Julie Marie, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. I can tell you exactly what the tier program cost. It's easier for me to use a completed fiscal year. So I'm going to look a little bit backwards and say fiscal year 2024, which was about $7.4 million was the total for fiscal year 2024. Of that, I have to look up another chart, but of that, if you'll give me a few minutes, I will be able to tell you exactly how much of that came from the Oxford Casino, and comparatively how much came from the milk handling fee. So if we can put a pin in that, I'll work on that.
Okay, so basically, if we were going to use the adult use cannabis, instead of 2 percentage points, it would have to be closer to 4 percentage points to fully fund the tier program.
I'm just going to reel us back for a moment, because I think this is one idea that I want to get the reaction of the rest of the subgroup to that, and also kind of flag the issue of any time that there is a sin tax increase, there are multiple interests that have an interest in using that additional revenue. So it's not a foregone conclusion that if that were, supported conceptually to increase those taxes, that it would necessarily be funneled to this program specifically. But just want to open it up for reaction. I know that there was some public comment at the last meeting that I read about taxes and fees can be problematic. And should we instead be kind of promoting the idea that this is an investment in our food system and demonstrating true economic returns? So just open it up for reaction.
Hey there. Sorry, Bill, I didn't mean to cut you off. Took me a minute to find my unmute. I agree with you, Jody. I don't know how much time we should spend on fine details of that. I'm fine with recommending, maybe we try a tobacco tax or something like that for dairy to help fund the tier program, but maybe we don't need to get far into the details. If
you're getting muffled a little bit, you think it's fine to, could you just repeat your perspective?
Yep, I think it's fine to recommend that we fund it at the full level and use something like a tobacco tax, but probably the legislators are going to want to do the fine detail figuring on that stuff, right? Maybe we shouldn't spend too much time on that.
Sure. I think what I'm going to do, let me just take the pulse of the subgroup members themselves from the task force. What I've done in the other subgroups is taken public ideas a little bit later on in the meeting which would mean Jenny and Representative Pluker taking your thoughts a little bit later, but I'm happy to do whatever the subgroup members would prefer. So just need a little bit of guidance on that. Let me just read comments here. Okay. Jenny, thanks. Okay, then I think I'll do that. Actually, Representative Pluka, are you able to stay on the line for the bulk of this call? Let's say it's an hour plus. And that
that's fine.
Okay. All right, we'll do that then, just to be consistent with how we've run other subgroup meetings. All right. So Julie Marie, did you want to provide any additional information just to sort of wrap that up, that concept up for the moment, or not?
I can, just to give you some context. So like I said, for FY24, the cost of the tier program was roughly 7.4 million. We took in about $1 million roughly in handling fee money contributed to the general fund. And let me get to the right page where I have and roughly yeah, I'm sorry.
It's fine. I'll circle back to you. Just raise your hand when you're ready. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Spreadsheet under pressure is never a good thing.
No, it's fine. We'll circle back to you. You just tell me when you're ready.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So on the broad category of alternative funding sources, one suggestion has been sin taxes, in particular tobacco or cannabis. I'm interested in additional subgroup members' reactions to potentially including that in a recommendation or creating a recommendation about designating additional funding through such a means. Go ahead, Julie Marie.
I'm just going to play a little bit of devil's advocate,
Sure.
and we're all looking into a crystal ball because ultimately we have to kind of take into account how the policymakers are going to view proposals like this. But where there is not already a connection to dairy in those two, we're going to have to be very well prepared to make the case as to why those funds should be going to dairy as opposed to where they're going now. I know the tobacco funds go to a variety of health and wellness outlets and things like that. And that just could become a whole other layer of challenging. That's not to dissuade it. It's just what it could be. Same with, I don't know how the marijuana income is allocated or if it's allocated to a specific spending activity. So we'd have to look at that. I know we do have the casino revenue that we already do have an established link in one area. And we do have several other types of gambling that have come online since that. Again, we have the political challenge of with those, I believe there's a cascade of a variety of different things that are already where that money is assigned. So we would have to be able to make the case that this should get, the tier program should get the money instead of somebody else. So Doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue it. It's just, we ought to know what we're going into.
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
So, one comment on the positive towards that. The tier program, when we're talking about it, internally here, we're talking about it as benefiting dairy farmers. But in reality, because it does not stay in dairy farmers' pockets, it's going directly out into the agricultural infrastructure, into the rural communities. The program has functioned for quite some time as an economic development program. So that brings up whether maybe we ought to be repackaging how we talk about this program in terms of the overall health of the agricultural sector and the rural communities that are benefiting from these funds that are being paid by dairy farmers, but are basically keeping all those other businesses going that benefit so many other layers of agriculture. So that's just another approach in the selling of whatever it is we come up with.
And I apologize, I can't raise my hand, I'm driving. It seems to kind of be what happens with me lately. But Julie Marie, I agree with you that if we tee up maybe even as not even just a subcommittee, but the entire committee, that the findings are linked to the economic development and sustainability of the rural communities, it shapes the conversation in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. Which then points back to the importance of the economic impact study. I'll take you in just 1 second, Bill. Craig just sent you a note. Bill, go ahead.
I believe that the economic study is important, but it has to be made human. One of the problems is that we talk about these numbers and whatnot, which is critical, but the real story is what it takes to be a dairy farmer. And very few people understand the commitment of the entire family, as well as a local community, to support a dairy farm. So to me, if we really want to sell the story, you get the economic underpinnings, but you turn it into actually an education of what it takes to be a dairy farmer, which by my reckoning is the hardest agricultural product on the market.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
I just had one thing. If nobody else has their hand up, I can't really tell if they do it off my end.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess it would be hard for me to go to Augusta next winter and advocate for taxing the sin, putting a tax on all what we perceive as sins. But I think and like somebody already said, I think that where we really put the anchor in is the fact that this is a social, not a social justice, but it is a complete food security issue for the state of Maine, and this money trickles back to everybody, not just dairy farmers. So that being said, and I'd just like to talk about we were talking about funding and forecasting. Every year when we're at the legislature asks Julie Marie or her predecessors to figure out what the next 3 years are going to look like, and it's an impossible task. Next month, if the future market comes through with the way it looks, there will be no tiers that would be paid out next month. Class 3 is in the mid 23s right now, meaning the combined blend price will be higher than 24.51. That being said, our pay price will still be below what our study suggested farmers would need to break even. So my point is, if we weren't expecting someone who doesn't have a crystal ball to project the next 3 years, then and just fully fund, we would be above or at a break even in next month and not still be below without actually having any money from the state, because that's what the legislature wanted, support to dairy farmers. But we won't have any support for dairy farmers because we'll be way under, the price of milk will be over what the 25% that we got at the legislature. So if that makes sense, I'm trying to focus on more than one thing here, but
Yeah.
I said I wasn't going to talk at all. I was just going to listen, but I couldn't help it.
No, thank you. No, important point. All right. What then? I'm happy to stick with this funding question. Craig, go ahead.
Well, I did have a question for Heath, just because I am taking notes and I want to make sure I understand. Had the tier, because of where the price is, had the tier program been funded at 100% of the short run break even point, would there still then would not have been a payment? Or is it because of that gap between the 100% and the 25% of that increase, so that there's not a payment, but there would have been in another scenario?
Well, and I'm talking more about next month than last month anyways.
Understood,
but correct. If it was fully funded, there still would have been a payment. But because it was only funded at the 25% of what we're looking for, then no, there won't be a payment.
Thank you.
If all the stars align.
Yeah. Okay. Bill, go ahead. Sorry, I forgot about you briefly. You're on mute.
Besides trying to forecast.
You're not coming through. Hold on. Just make sure that you're not covering your speaker, because you're not. We can't hear you.
How's my voice right now?
That's good.
Okay. I think we have to figure, if we're going to fund the tier program, it has to be able to do 100%. And if the tier program is forced to make projections when it can't really do it statistically, then we're always going to run into the problem that we're in right now, which is that it's possible for the legislature to have already committed to some level, which will not fund the whole thing.
And so a solution to that.
If the funding were to all come from some source, which is independent of the legislature or of the forecasting, i.e. sin taxes, then it would be a function of having set that tax rate at a level that covers all of the requirements.
Julie Marie?
I think there might be a structural issue here, because the authority for the sin taxes would be, it still has to come into the general fund. And because it has to do that, it would still require a legislative action to direct that money from the sin tax to the tier program. So I as opposed to the Oxford Casino, which has a formula set in and it goes to a dedicated account. And that's how, and that number just is and automatically comes to us. But we might have a harder time through the sin taxes, because again, we're asking at that point Maine Revenue Service to be the collector, and it would be up to the legislature to parcel out the money. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. If the legislature doesn't come on board with some way to fully fund the tier program's in trouble. I mean, I think the program itself is excellent. The mechanisms are there. We can tweak a bunch of stuff to make it better. But I think what's come out of the discussion so far is that the selling job of why this is important, not only just to the farmers, but to the entire state, needs to be much stronger than it has been.
Let me ask a question. Maybe this is just trying to to punt a little bit, but one idea is to craft a recommendation that first and foremost says that the task force fully supports full funding of the tier program, that
Yep.
it acknowledges that, that's been a challenge in past years, and either, there needs to be some commitment to do that irrespective of other funding priorities, or here is an array of funding, ideas that the task force had, including, tobacco and cannabis, or to your point, Julie Marie, other gambling taxes, but that those are a means to an end, and what's most critical is the end of fully funding the tier program. And leave it at that, because we're not going to solve that. We're not those decision makers in terms of what funding source gets chosen.
I just had one comment on that is, this is, if this is truly beneficial to every Maine citizen or nearly every Maine citizen, we all pay taxes. And we want to be able to say, hey, we have a funding source, so that when we go to the legislature, we can say, here's the funding coming in. So it's an easy argument, pass it back out. But if it's truly something that every citizen in the state of Maine benefits from, there's nothing wrong with just paying it out of tax money, because we're all benefit from it. We all benefit from the roads. We all benefit from many things that our taxes pay for. So I don't think that it needs to be, it'll be the end if we don't find a funding source, but it's a harder fight. That's all.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Well, I think then Craig and I have the makings to be able to draft a recommendation to then get your the full task force's perspective on that in October. And there'll be a couple of meetings to tweak it further, whether you want to be singling out and identifying potential other funding sources or not. That can be a conversation that is had with the full task force. Julie Marie, go ahead.
I think it's really important in the report that we highlight, what is it about the tier program that is critical to its success? And yes, it's funding, but it's the predictability of that funding. It's that the farmers can count on receiving that safety net no matter what the market does. And that gives them the tools to juggle their bills, to decide about making investments in the farm, and those other important. It also is a big selling point for the viability of the future generation of whether or not that farm can cash flow. So I would hope that at the same time we're talking about, this is a program that broadly benefits Mainers beyond just dairy farmers. In order for it to really work, it needs to be consistent. It needs to be predictable. Yeah.
Sure. Yep. Thank you. Okay. I'm inclined then to move on to some of the other topics that you dealt with during your first meeting, to make sure that we've got as much meat on the bones as you'd like. One of those was this question of, well, I'll just read it out. The quality of the study, of the cost of production study, is completely dependent on the quality of data gathered. There was a robust discussion of how and whether to mandate or encourage or incentivize greater participation in the study. And then from that, you also generated some conversation about how to reduce the burden that data collection creates on farmers, and are there ways to make that more efficient? So I'm wondering, just pointedly, is there a recommendation that you have that speaks to this issue? Bill, go ahead.
Yeah. Julie Marie, who directs, what organization? Is your organization that directs the study?
The Milk Commission is required by statute to conduct the study. And the statute directs the information that is contained within the study. Over the years, as the legislative mandate to gather information for the tier program has been clarified and has become the overriding mission of the cost reduction study, the Milk Commission has had to back off on some of the other data that is gathered, just because there's only so much that we have the resources to be able to fund. And again, it's every 3 years. So it is fit in between our schedule. We have other studies that we have to do on the off years.
Is there a funding problem there too?
A little bit. The over the years, as the amount of milk being produced in Maine and sold in Maine has dropped, so have the Milk Commission fees. And just like the farms, our expenses have gone up. I'm also anticipating that the next time we do this cost of production study, it is going to be significantly more expensive, because the person that we had been relying on it's not likely that I think this previous one was his last study that he was interested in doing. So it's gonna be put out to bids, and my guess is the competitive bids are going to be significantly above what we were being charged before.
So the nature of your questions, Bill, as it relates to the question that I was asking about whether you as a subgroup would like to be making a particular recommendation around participation in data provision.
Yes. Once again, get back to
Again, it's hard to hear you.
Okay. Once again, can you hear me?
No, are you covering up
Something's happening
anything
to
on
your mic.
computer? Any hands next to your computer screen, your computer keyboard that might be impeding the microphone?
No, nothing.
Why don't you give it a try again?
How about this? How does
That's
that sound?
That's great.
All right. We seem to keep running into a funding problem. Basically what Julie Marie has said, and I totally believe her, because that's true everywhere, that the cost of doing this is going to balloon maybe as much as double the next time they have to do it. And with the funding the way it is right now, I don't see how that can get done. It gets cut back so bad, or it's not valid, or another whole method has got to be determined.
Well, I'll channel Commissioner Beal here that I don't think we want to restrict the recommendations that we offer because we have not identified a clear funding source for it yet. I think that I certainly have gleaned from the notes from the last meeting that you all felt strongly about the importance of a robust economic impact study. How that's funded is another important question, but I think so we're talking about 2 studies here, and I know in past meetings that you've had in plenary, there's been some conversation about how you can sort of combine them in some ways. But at the moment, I was asking about the cost of production study. And, oh, go ahead, Craig.
Well, and just to help you out, since you weren't at the meeting, what I recall in terms of, is there going to be a recommendation around this? Some of the ideas that I recall hearing was that there would be some kind of standardized tool or portal that would be shared with all producers, and they would be expected to populate that on an ongoing basis so that the triennial data collection wasn't such a heavy lift. People were just plugging in their information all along. That was, for example, one idea. That there would be some kind of stipend paid to those who would be willing to participate as a way to induce more people to be more forthcoming with their information. I think there were others, but I think, to kind of get back to Jody's question, is there actually a recommendation along those or any other lines that perhaps, if people are concerned about the quality of the data and the cost of production study, do folks have ideas about solving that data quality problem?
Thank you. Very
And I
well put.
see Julie Marie's hand up.
Julie Marie, go ahead.
Thanks. Just to point out that if we were to do some kind of automated, having people voluntarily or with a requirement input their own data, there are going to be some challenges because number one, we would need to either piggyback off somebody like Cornell that already has a study like that, and then we wouldn't have as much control over how that data is managed. Or we have to set up one of our own, which is going to have an upfront price tag.
Sure.
So we just need to be mindful of that. The other thing is having them individually put in their information is fine, except the idea of an investigator going out and looking at the books is a way of verifying that everybody is putting in, everybody has the same interpretation of when you say, what is your gross income? Everybody has that same interpretation of what that means. And making sure that that's only milk income, not beef or hay or anything else. So, I mean, there does need to be a very active human element in there just to make sure everything is clarified. It will be much easier to do for those farms who are using QuickBooks or some variation like that to help organize their financial management. The ones that don't, which are likely to be on the tier 1 and maybe 2 side, it's going to be a lot harder to do apples and apples with the data. So, I mean, those are some of the challenges we have, not insurmountable. And, we do have carrots at our disposal. We have obviously the carrot of receiving the tier payment. But we would probably it would require a statutory change to say you must participate in order to get your payment. Another thing that we could look at as a carrot right now, when we figure out the tier payment, we take the blend price and we add an over order premium, and then we compare that against the safety net level. The only ones who get an over order premium are those who are basically shipping to Agrimark, DFA, and Oakhurst, since Holton Farms is really not going to be in the picture. And so right now, all the organic farms do not have an overorder premium added on. If we were, since this is all based on conventional data, we could offer, if the farm participated, put forward their data, we could exempt, say that the overorder premium does not get added on to there. And that means they would get a little bit more in their tier payment. It's just a thought.
Okay, let me just grab, I saw Annie that you had your hand up, and I want to bring you into the conversation since we haven't heard from you before.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm also driving, so apologize for that. I do not think I'm actually completely against tying the tier to any qualifier. I think that opens up a can of worms that it's just it's a path we should not go down. So I would oppose adding to our recommendations that I understand the need for good data, and I think incentivizing farms, especially tier 1 farms, incentivizing them in some way is a more appropriate recommendation for this committee to make. And I know in the initial survey that's sent out, there is a question in it that's asked. Oops, sorry. I know there's a question that's asked about their method of bookkeeping, but I wonder if there is a way to get sort of a deeper look at folks who do have a more robust bookkeeping system, and if there's a way to kind of categorize those people as like prioritizing them in the cost of production study, or if it all has to be, if you just randomly draw, or how it works. So maybe that's worth looking into.
Got it. All right, super helpful. Thank you. Okay, then Julie Marie.
Just a couple of things to respond to what Annie is saying, and to keep in mind, when we do the cost of production studies, we do have an initial paper survey that is meant to gather demographic and general kind of business management information. It's just aggregated, so we don't keep track of which farm has which system, that type of thing. But when it comes to actually doing the cost of production data, gathering that information, it is much more it's much more highly technical in terms of the financial side, in the questions it's asking. It's not just asking generic. It's really digging down pretty intensely into the management. So like I say, it does make it easier if somebody has the electronic information. As far as the incentivizing, that overorder premium is one way to incentivize it. It basically equates to about between 22 and 25 cents a hundredweight per month that would the farms would receive. So
Thank you.
This might be a different way to ask the same question, and I guess I will put people on the spot. I'm directing this at Libby and Heath and Annie. If you think about providing information to the cost of production study, whether you currently do or don't, are there specific things that would lower the barriers to you doing that would make it easier for you to do it, that would make it more worth your time to do it? Any tweaks to how it's done now?
I think if you have access to the information, it makes it far easier. We're an organic farm, so we don't participate, but I do my own cost of production study. I mean, I do my own cost of production because I've had access to a spreadsheet that I use, that I've worked with a technical service provider. So if you have it in a spreadsheet from your QuickBooks, if you have it from any sort of accounting software, it's easier, it's much easier to do than if it's just sort of living in your box of receipts. Which, as you know, any sort of accounting is always easier when you have it in a spreadsheet. But I would say part of the challenge is also that so many of this financial data is attached to us emotionally. And especially if things are not going well on your farm, it is really difficult to have somebody else come and look at your books and see exactly how badly things are potentially. So there's a real emotional component that can be really hard to overcome, I think, for a lot of farmers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would just build on that. Honestly, it's really not that hard. It's kind of super simple. If you have the information, if you have, done your taxes, it's this year, it was kind of right after tax season. We were just getting our taxes finished up when the cost of production, or the last time the cost of production was done. It's really super simple. I would say the human part of it, like Julie was talking about, as many times, because we're not talking about income, we're talking about costs. So lots of times it's that takes that human to fish out, like, oh, I walked on your farm and I saw 20 beef cows over there. We do not want that in the cost of production, because that has nothing to do with the dairy part of it. Or, maybe a farm did some custom work chopping corn for another farm, or so that fuel that was used for that needs to come out of your cost of production. So that's where that human part, but needs, really helps. But yeah, I would agree with Andy. I think a lot of it is just that perception that they don't want to have people looking at their books. It would be a lot more fun if we made a lot of money and then you could say, look how great I'm doing. But I think a lot of people just, it's here to help us. Nobody's judging. So,
Yeah.
but I can't imagine making it any easier on the farmer side. It's just a matter of getting them to do it. And when we have the opportunity, we ask these farmers, get it done. It's worth getting off the tractor. You're not going to make more money today than the tier program will help you in the long run. So it's like it's just a matter of, you really need to like get off the tractor and get that information to the person that's doing the study.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, then I'm going to jump around again and then take public comment to make sure that we have the benefit of that. Another item that was raised at the last meeting was, this idea of the necessity of building support both within the legislature and broadly publicly around the value of the dairy sector. And so I think, everyone was in agreement around the importance of that, but I'm not sure that you went the next step to say, really, what is the best mechanism for doing that? A big marketing campaign, like what exactly is needed to instill that. I'll turn my audio off while the phone's ringing, sorry, and take whoever has an idea. Go ahead, Bill.
I'm not sure the question you're asking.
So are there specific ideas that you have as a group of how to be instilling in the legislature in particular the importance of the dairy industry beyond simply a more robust cost economic impact study?
My mind, it really gets back to the human story. The dairy farming is the hardest thing that I've ever seen. You can make the numbers, but nobody understands that this is a 365-day, 24-hour gig, period, with the whole family. And more help. The more you get, the larger you get, the more help you need.
Julie Marie.
I think Bill is right that the numbers are important, and doing an economic impact study is helpful, because then we can put it in a context compared to tourism, compared to potatoes, compared to, whatever. so that people can get a better feel for just, how involved the dairy industry is. How many times does that dollar turn over in the community? But it is important to put a face and a name and a family to that information, so that people feel like they're, we talk about the dairy industry. Industry tends to be a very impersonal word. It brings up corporate and whatever. We don't have those kind of farms. And so we need to instill upon both the legislators and the public that, these are your neighbors. These are people who are multi-generations of doing this kind of work in the state. And it is storytelling with numbers.
Yeah, thank you.
It-
Annie,
it-
go ahead.
We this past end of July, we had the the Agricultural Council of Maine, had our legislative tour, and we went to several different farms, sort of in the mid coast. We visited a bunch of different farms, and one of them was mine. And we had such a great response from legislators. And Heath and I have been talking about this ever since, that putting together a dairy farm tour for legislators, even around the Augusta, sort of like the central Maine area, we could visit various sizes of farms. I think it could be really beneficial to show legislators, like, right where you work, there are dairy farms right in their backyard, and then giving them sort of like a map of farms that's more specific to their backyards. I mean, just having legislators who've never been on farms before set foot on a dairy farm and understand the scope of even like my small farm, they were like, whoa, this is quite an operation. And then have them go to, other farms like the Flood Farm and see what an operation that is. I just think there's only so much you can tell people until and I think showing them would really make a big difference. And so it's something Heath and I have been talking about, trying to maybe put together something like that, and and hopefully getting some maybe department support in enticing legislators to attend, because that's the hardest thing, is getting them on the bus. And we can put together the greatest tour in the world, but will they show up? That's the question at the end of the day. But I mean, like, I was thinking, like, do we make some sort of requirement that legislators have to set foot on a dairy farm or have to set foot on all these different farms to understand what we're talking about? But I really do think it would make a big difference.
Great, that's super helpful. Thank you. Craig, go ahead.
It's occurring to me, I just want to say it, that there's a order of operations challenge I think that the group is going to face, because there's a recommendation to gather the data to make the economic impact case, but that within the report back to the legislature, I think we're saying we need to make part of that case in the report back, the economic impact case, even if part of what the report is asking for is resources to do the bigger economic impact study. And similarly, part of what the report back may be acknowledging is that we need to tell these stories, and we need better kind of narrative frames for telling these stories. But the report back itself is probably going to need to engage in that better storytelling so that it has traction. So anyway, I'm just saying it sounds like that we may need to figure out how to do some of the things that we're asking for before we get a chance to get what we're asking for.
Fully agree.
I just had a quick thing on. So, and this is more of a question, I guess, for maybe you, Craig. If we were able to get industry funding for an economic impact study, whether that was some from the dairy industry itself and some from, maybe some supporting businesses, how could we utilize that funding and at the same time not be perceived as studying our own problem. We want to come up with like data that legislators aren't going to throw in the garbage because it was made by industry. So would those two things be compatible?
I think they would be. I mean, I think there are examples out there. Blueberries does this all the time. Potatoes does this all the time. Where they, yeah, I don't think, and maybe during the public comment section, Representative Pluker would be willing to opine on what is and isn't credible to him and his peers. But it seems to me that often it is the sectors that are the most reliable sources of information. And I don't think that would be immediately suspect.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was planning, it's 2:58. I was planning at 3:00 to open it up to public comment. So why don't we shift to that? And I know that both Representative Pluker and Jenny some time ago had some thoughts. So let me take you, Representative Pluker, if you'd like.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you to everybody for putting in all the hours and making this work. We worked hard to get to this point. Thank you for it all. Yeah, I'd say just to comment quickly on, an industry economic impact statement, I think is valuable. It's better than nothing. I think that we're, as legislators, very accustomed to the fact that just about any data we see has a source and you take that source into account. But it's still important to have. And I think that reframing the conversation that the tier program is an investment, not an expense, I think is an important one for legislators to hear. And I think getting people onto farms would help give some background, some strength to that argument. But the comment I wanted to make earlier, and I hope is, and something that I found really frustrating this past session, is the system of fiscal notes. So, we were told, and this goes back to what Heath was saying earlier, that, from what he can tell from Milk Futures, which of course is a crystal ball and nobody understands, that there might not be any payments next year on the tier program. And the big fight we had, and the reason we scaled back the numbers so hard compared to the cost of production study, was because we were told it was going to cost an outrageous sum of money. If I remember correctly, something like $50 million. So we had to scale it back to 26. And so now, perhaps in 2 years or 3 years, we're going to be looking at another situation where we didn't spend all the money that we set aside to fund the tier program. And it really creates this sense of crisis in the State House that I think is really based on the numbers more than it's based on reality. And so coming up with a stronger way of predicting how much the milk tier program will cost us, I think would take away some of that crisis moment and really give us like a better chance to budget going forward. So one, having stronger fiscal notes to work off of for the legislature. Another piece is, if we don't spend all that 26 million we set aside, say we only spend 13 million, then that 13 million should go back to the tier program for funding it, because maybe that 26 million is sufficient for funding us 4 years out and not just the 2 we were talking about. There's no way of knowing, but so we had the similar problem. It was this past January where we had an extra $6 million that we had budgeted that had never been spent. And we went as the Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry Committee, we put together a committee bill and asked for that money, that $6 million, to go to the farmers. We weren't successful in the end, and all we got in the end was an earlier cost of production study, which was great. But I think that's another potential thing, is if we've already budgeted this money, it shouldn't just fall back into the general fund. Let's move it forward. And then finally, my other dream, as long as I'm dreaming, is a bond. What happened if we were to put together a fund that was a permanent fund, that we took the interest out of it and put it towards the tier program every year as a way of underwriting the expenses of it? if we were able to get it through the legislature, we need 2/3 from of each body, and we need the governor's approval. But I feel like there's an opportunity for that. And then we would need to get approval at the ballot box. But I also feel like there's potential there as well. So those are my ideas.
Great, thank you so much. Excuse me. Jenny, did you still have a comment that you'd like to make?
Yes, and I've been struggling with internet issues, so if you can't hear me or I break up too much, please just let me know. Thank you for the time again today. With regards, and I don't want to beat the dead sin horse, but with regards to the discussion of the sin tax, I think that it's easier to talk about those when we refer to them as sin taxes, when in fact we're talking about taxing other ag for our sector of ag, especially when you get into adult use cannabis in the state of Maine. We have, whether we like it or not, and whether you have an opinion on it, it is a form of agriculture. And I'm not sure that I want to be in the position of saying that my agriculture is worth taxing someone else's and taking it from them. And I don't know how the sustainability of that plan would truly help make dairy farms whole. And I just wanted to add that. And I also had a question, and this has been brought up multiple times in multiple meetings, and it was articulated again today by both Julie Marie and Heath. But for me, in a summary form, it's about looking at this as an actual investment in the economic development of Maine. So my question is should we be looking at this not just through the lens and burden upon DACF, and looking at it, how is the Department of Economic Development, how can they be keyed in? How can we bring in other factors and entities to truly work to create a solution that goes way beyond the actual farmyard? And that's something that's been brought up by the farmers on this call, as well as the folks that are industry stakeholders here. And I just really want to just mention it as a member of the public and a dairy farmer. And I also wanted to mention that I feel strongly that if farmers want to partake of the cost of production benefits that come from that report with regards to the tier program, then yeah, they probably should be participating in the cost of production requests. However, it is very unfair to put a requirement on a sector and business that doesn't have any experience or is not well prepared to do it. So if there's going to be a requirement, and I'm not saying there shouldn't, but there should also be onboarding and education resources and training available that allows that to happen. And I don't think the incentive should be a payment. I think because they're getting paid, the tier program is going to help them. And I also think it would be the least we could do when we're saying we want people to make an investment in our industry. And what it does is to make sure that the basis of this investment, this cost reduction, is actually sound and robust and something we can use as a tool ourselves on our farms, for our businesses, for our communities, and for this program. And one last thing, and I wouldn't have had it, but Representative Pluker brought up a really good point. And instead of having to do this yo-yo back and forth every single session, it feels like, even though I know it technically isn't, but is there any way for the money to just go into a special place for dairy as opposed to it having to be teased out and asked for? I know that requires opening up a can of worms, but aren't we at the point where we want to open up a can of worms and make this so that it is actually considered part of the pillars of our investment in our food system? That yes, this is the money that is dedicated to this, and this is where it goes, and this is what it's used for. And if it's not being used for this right now, then guess what? We're going to make sure that it's invested back in somehow. But I feel like if you build something like that, then it becomes part of the foundation, and people spend more time trying to build up and fortify foundations than breaking them down. And I just feel that that might be a good way to go. And you're welcome for not having to see me on camera because I'm using my hands an awful lot today.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. I see, let me just, before I take you, Julie Marie, are there other members, non-subgroup members who would like to join the conversation and comment? Just get rid of this. Okay, I'm not seeing other hands. Julie Marie, go ahead.
Thanks. I think, both Representative Pluker and Jenny brought up the issue of, what if the money were put in essentially a dedicated account that then that money could, if we don't use it all, could roll over to be used in the next year or whatever. But I got to play devil's advocate in that we right now, there are two things. One is, what if we need more money than is projected? Right now, the way it's written, however much money we need, we ask the controller to transfer over. And that is how we're able to get whatever is needed for the tier program. We would not have that flexibility if it were a dedicated account, because then if we need more money than we have in the account, we either have to go back for another appropriation, or we'd have to reduce in some way the payments that go out to farmers. And that takes away the predictability. So, I mean, there's a lot of good things that it would be made easier, would be made even more predictable in a lot of ways for the budget writers, if we could put it in a dedicated account. But there are also some unique things in the tier program that make it so it doesn't quite fit as well. And then the other thing to keep in mind is we've been through a period where state government revenues have been quite robust. But there have been times where that hasn't been the case, and the conversations about the tier program have been quite brutal. It wasn't an issue of, well, this is a little bit more than we can handle this. It was, we're asking departments and everybody to cut everywhere. How does the tier program somehow get exempted from that? So just to round out the conversation.
Sure.
I just had a quick comment, Jody, if there was nobody else.
Please go ahead, Heath.
So in kind of response to Representative Pluker, so, buying the fact that if there was no pandemic and no crazy inflation that had happened during the pandemic, if the program was fully funded and we ended up having a whole bunch of money that didn't get paid out to farmers because the price of milk was high, that would be totally fine. Take that money and put it right back into the general fund, because the price of milk was higher than our short run break even, meaning farmers are okay or better. So I think the key is the fully funding. If it was fully funded, it would be okay. If it's not fully funded and the price of milk goes up, farmers don't get that money that legislators wanted to see them get. And they still needed it because we were still below the short run break even cost of production. So that was my comment.
Yeah, thank you. Bill, go ahead.
I'd like to make is more of a financial thing. The tier program basically is not an investment in dairy farms. It's a method of making sure that dairy farms ideally have enough money above their cost of production to stay alive. So it's an operating type. If you're doing a bond or something, ideally those are things that are investment for the long term. So the tier is basically short term, investment is long term.
thank you. I want to just, we have just a few more minutes. I think I put this on the calendar originally as 2 hours and then noticed that the other two subgroups had dedicated 1.5 hours. I want to be respectful of people's time, and I don't want to belabor topics if you think that we have the basis for at least some initial recommendation generation for the full task force to consider. I want to just see if you could take a moment to take a look at the notes from the first meeting, and see whether there are any other topics that you don't feel like we've circled back to today that you'd like to spend the last few minutes on.
And if anybody would like me to share my screen with the notes, it might be complicated because it's a page and a half. So I couldn't show it all at once, but I'm happy to do it.
Well, I can read quickly on the second page. There were 3 points for further consideration or recommendation. One was an economic impact study to support the case for the program. I do think we've spoken about that. The second is better data on which to base the program, including better tools and systems for collecting that data. And the third was a tool for producers to calculate tier payments. And Julie Marie volunteered to provide the information to farmers who call. Anything more that you'd like to discuss on those 3 items? And then Jenny, I'll take you again. So Jenny, go ahead.
And I thank you for letting me speak again. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry I didn't recall this point before, but I don't know if I could speak for any other dairy farmer than myself in this, but as much as I appreciate and admire and am incredibly grateful for the tier program, I would really love for the tier program to be the smallest part of why Maine is an amazing place to be a dairy farmer. I would love for it to be the fail-safe. I would love for it to be the fallback. And I would love for Maine to just be an amazing place to know that your dairy is produced sustainably with a triple bottom line of sustainability, economic, environmental, and community. And that when those things can't measure up due to unforeseen environmental concerns or economic issues, that the tier program will be there 100% to fully fund the farmers who need it most. I just want to make sure that when this entire task force gets together beyond this subgroup, that the tier program is not the driving force and the fulcrum to get us all through. It is what we turn to. And I would much rather see everything else fall into place than have to rely upon this. And I don't know if that's possible, but I just wanted you to hear that from a dairy farmer, because I think that we all want to be able to make milk and put food on the table. And we want to be able to do it in a way that we can do it for our families too. So thank you for pleasuring me on this one. Sorry.
No, not at all. Thank you. BRB, just want to make sure I've got comments here on the side. Yeah. Okay. Then I'm inclined to put us to work, us meaning staff at DACF, to try to turn your 2 conversations into some draft recommendations. And the way we've talked about this is not necessarily, given the time crunch, you won't see these as a subgroup in advance of it going out to the full group. What you will remember, hopefully, is that these are initial drafts for the full task force to be, having that conversation. So if in October you come to that meeting and you really think we got it wrong, then that's the time to just say, you really got it wrong, and let's start tweaking these. Any other final comments before we wrap up? All right. Thank you all so much for your time. Again, Craig, do you have your calendar on you that just shows the date of the October meeting? I think it might be the 10th, but I'm afraid to say it.
Tom, do you happen to have it handy? I'll scroll forward.
Yeah, I don't have it right here.
Okay, no worries. I'll get it out.
It's the
Um,
7th.
October 7th?
Yeah.
Thank you. And we're still
there.
working on rooms. I suspect that we will be back in Deering 106 because we're having difficulty finding any room that's larger than that. But you'll get that information from me.
And both Deering rooms are tied up that day.
I think we have one of them booked, but we'll see.
Maybe.
Okay. Okay.
Mm.
All right. Thank you all. We'll be in touch soon. Take care. Tom, would you mind staying on the line?
Thank you.
Thanks, Annie.